nearer to the village because they can't get the water now, it's too far to go. Women are actually not just victims, but they are really adapting, doing things differently. But we must be very careful about not just burdening them more. And I think the other point which has really come up again is the whole issue about women's role in the negotiations, because at the moment women women as women in their own right, just as women taking part in the negotiations, and then women looking at the special and different needs of women are all really largely being ignored in these negotiations, and that cannot be right. There's lots of information now about sort of, in terms of, for instance, the financial mechanisms that are being proposed. Again, women are sort of getting left out of the adaptation discussions, and yet they're the ones who will know what needs to be adapted in a country. So at every level, we need to engage women, from that country level where they can take part in the national adaptation planning, right through to Copenhagen.
How difficult is the road from the national level to Copenhagen? How difficult are the steps to get over? I mean, this is not a new issue. This is not something that's coming up today or this year. So what have been the difficulties?
Well, I think it is a huge problem. Fortunately, there are women, again, who are trying to take the lead in pushing this through. There is now a global gender climate action group that is really monitoring the negotiations and looking at what is being discussed in the text now that will affect women, and that's very important. That group has also been training the delegates on the negotiations groups, and I think they've been through about 60 delegates at the moment, but clearly more is needed to be done. But another thing we've got at the Oxfam end, we've got some nice young people called climate trackers, and they're being attached to the delegates from their own countries around the world, and they blog all the time about what their delegates are saying and send it back home. Now, they're being particularly trained up in how to ask what their delegates are doing on gender issues and send that back home as well. And it's things like that that we need to have happen, but it's really uphill. I mean, there are so few women in the delegations, and the mention of gender issues or what the different needs of women are very, very few.
Malini, from your work on the ground in India, how do we move then from raising issues to actually more pragmatic steps and becoming active on the ground?
Thanks very much, Siba. Good morning, everyone. Let me just pull back and put this in a little bit more context in the way that speakers before me have really, to recognize why it is that we need to continue talking about women and gender until rooms like this are not full mostly of men. I think that is symptomatic of where we are right now. We are at the Global Humanitarian Forum. It's about humanity. Women are more than 50% of humanity, and yet in this representative room, we have more men than women. So for me, that says something about the need to have women's leadership put centrally into the discussion box, to have a strong emphasis on including them, but not just as tokenism, but really making sure that women are there as decision takers, decision makers at every step of the rung. I want to illustrate some of the points that you had made in your introduction. You made a passing remark at the beginning, which I think was a very accurate observation about why is it that we see on the media, the images are typically of women and children as victims. It is because largely when catastrophe strikes, women and children are the victims. And part of that is explainable because we know that women are the least likely to actually hear the official early warning systems. We know that when they leave their households, they are responsible for picking up the children and carrying them. If you're loaded with children and if you don't hear the early warning systems in time, you will be much more susceptible to actually drowning, being hit by a fallen tree, or whatever the natural catastrophe is. I think that although we've been talking about the need to mainstream gender since 1995, I was there in Beijing, we haven't really made it a core focus of political dialogue, which is why yesterday when Margaret Chan made, which to me was the single most sensible recommendation I've heard so far, she said the best thing that you can do is educate girls and invest in women. If we're serious about climate change, we know that the human impacts of climate change are largely as a consequence of human behavior. Just look at the population rise. I'm a feminist and I have worked all of my life to enlarge the space for women's access to good reproductive health care and rights. But I think population is an issue in this. And I think if we're serious about this, the best thing that we can do is adopt the best contraceptive, which is invest in girl children. Because otherwise, if we don't, we are inevitably going to reach 9 billion by 2050. Actually, that does not necessarily have to be inevitable. If we start implementing the commitments that have been made for decades to invest in the girl child and move it just beyond the rhetorical poster child image that we find on television screens, to actually making sure that each of us acts in our spheres of influence to challenge the injustice and the bias against girl children. I'll give you an example of that. In my Delhi office, okay, my organization, we work across India, and we have more women, 3/4 of us are women, yeah? And so the men always plead special interest because they say we're in the minority in this organization. And you're like, well, we hire on the basis of talent and merit, okay? But to give you an illustration, my, Lakshmi, who works in my Delhi office, she's 36 years old, yeah? She's younger than I am. And I would have thought that she is someone who has spent most of her life in the city, even though her family comes from a village in Rajasthan, that she would have had access to improved, education. She would have had higher status. She works in an office. But here is a woman who was forced to have 6 girl children through the pressure of her mother-in-law, because even though she's gainfully employed, her mother-in-law was not satisfied until she had a boy. And after she had 6 girls, she finally said, enough is enough. I'm not having any more. And it's people like Lakshmi that we have to intervene in their lives. So our intervention was, we gave her a job. We gave her all sorts of benefits. We helped in, supporting her children going through school. So I'm saying this is the personal agenda for all of us. And unless we personalize it, we will continue to talk at a rhetorical level up here. And it will not filter down to change realities.
But these are very, very conservative societies, and they could be very resistant to change. And I find sometimes in those societies, it is the women themselves who are resistant to change. That is actually, if you want to say, maybe victimizing them or putting them at that disadvantage.
It could be, but societies change and cultures change all the time. In my country, we had the Jains, who are the most spiritual, the most peace-loving community. These are people who walk around with masks because they don't want to ingest by accident flies. These are people who went in for amniocentesis tests so that they could kill girl fetuses. So cultures change depending on what the prevailing cultural preference is. In my society, unfortunately, we have an abiding male preference. There are ways in which you can intervene at a programmatic level to actually challenge that. So if you look, I come from Delhi, I'm from the north of India, and we have a much more deeply ingrained machismo in our society than there is in the south of India. And so if you look across the Indian states, you will find that levels of literacy for women, levels of women's employment outside the household has for quite some time been different, higher in states like Kerala, all the southern states, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, etc. And that is not divine intervention. That is because there were programmatic interventions, largely a focus on girl children, which were effective.
Mr. Swaminathan, are you a feminist?
Well, as the only male on this panel, let me first preface my remarks saying that I fully agree with what the women have said. I think what Barbara said, all negotiations, all policies and programs must be engendered for the reasons already mentioned by our people. I think that's usually forgotten. Secondly, I think we have to make a distinction between urban women and rural women. The percentage of rural women varies from place to place. There are parts of Africa, 80%. In India, it is 70% now. Because whether you are urban woman or rural woman, there are 3 important things are necessary. One is food, water, and work or livelihood. In the case of women support services, because of the multiple burden which you mentioned in the beginning, the burden which they have, the special support services, whether it is creches, whether it is daycare centers, and so on. All of them are absolutely essential, even normal times, whether climate change or not. But then how are you going to have a study the impact of climate change on women living in urban areas? Many of them, when you say poor woman, you put a qualification poor woman, then you have also the problem of being in slums. Many times they live in slums without any support system of any kind and so on. So we must, the livelihood will become endangered both in rural areas and urban areas. People have more problem of getting jobs and income. Having said that, let me also add 1 or 2 words about why